All right, let's rock and roll. Thank you all very much for joining us today. We're here for the Crisis Management for COVID-19 Week 7. When we started this, who would ever dream we'd be doing this 7 weeks later? But the laws keep changing, the information keeps changing, and we're going to keep bringing you updates. So today, most of our time is going to be focused on the legal update and the best practices. And we've gotten a lot of questions throughout the week. We really appreciate this. People have been writing in. We try to answer them as they come when we can. But a lot of them we saved up just over the weekend here and Friday to share with you today. And Jim is even overnight, some things have changed. So Jim has been hot on it trying to get everything updated. And I bet you he's about to put up some slides right now.
They should be up.
Should be.
Are they not up? Oh, 1 second. Sorry.
No, but I love looking at all the photos of everybody. I'm sorry everybody doesn't have their video on because I think it's a great pleasure to see so many people I know and love. But here's what we've got on tap for today. Jim Morris is back to talk to us about legal updates. We're also going to have another special guest, and that is Governor Andy Beshear will be joining us about 11:15. And when he does, we'll just interrupt what we're doing and give him a chance to share some of his thoughts with us, and then we'll move back to the regular agenda. Allison Petrie is back. She's our manager of outsourcing for HRG, and she's got some things to share. Chase Adams is working behind the scenes to make this thing run properly, and he's assisted by Adam Morris. So I appreciate our team kind of keeping up with all this stuff. How are we doing on slides, Jim? There you go. Here's what we're going to cover today. We're going to start out with unemployment issues because, boy, oh boy, you'll be surprised to hear what Jim learned. We knew when the team was on here from unemployment, they didn't have everything quite right. And finally, they admitted it and apologized, and things are getting straightened out. So your input is driving change in Frankfurt that I think is going to make some positive differences. But the number 2 on the agenda is the governor, and he'll speak when he joins us. And then we're going to do some more legal updates and some of the regulatory changes that are happening even as we speak, it seems like. And then towards the end, we've got a recap and update and we're going to share with you some resources that we found to be very helpful. And I think you'll find them helpful too. We've got email addresses and other things so that you can reach out and get information. So, Jim, why don't you start and jump in on unemployment?
All right, so I'm going to get right to it because there are some big things going on. And as Lyle said, as soon as the governor joins, we'll be jumping in with the governor cutting off. And I'll come back to this, so don't panic if I don't cover it all. If you recall from week 3, we had some discussions with Josh Benton and Muncie about the executive director about the issues related to the Kentucky unemployment laws. And at that time, they corrected me and said, oh no, salaried employees cannot participate in work share. And it kind of caught me off guard because the way the statute was set up from the United States CARES Act was anyone whose salary or wages were reduced was entitled to participate. But I did correct it in week 4, 5, and 6 until things got to a point this last week where I knew something was wrong, and I started to press quite a bit on challenging what was going on because it was flat wrong. So, salaried employees, this is the wrong information that was provided. It said the salaried employees were ineligible. And then this was the quote that blew me away, and this is what got me moving last week. The quote was, someone can make too much, and this wasn't just work share. Someone can make too much and not be eligible for state unemployment assistance. If 80% of their weekly earnings are more than $552, then that person would not receive UI benefit. And then it went on to say that means they would not receive any federal. That comment really infuriated me because I just given guidance to an employer as their retained general counsel that this was the way they were allowed to do it. They could work share. I did tell them about salaried employees, But for hourly employees, the question was asked in this particular instance, cutting it back from, I think it was $27 to $21. And then they were told by the government, nope, you don't qualify because you have to be 80% of the 552 max benefit. Next one was, if you had a salaried worker, you have a contract with your employer, so it is a labor and contract dispute between the employee and employer. That's not true. People are employed at will and under Kentucky law. Unless you have a separate contract, you are not under a contract with that employee where if you change their wages, you're somehow in a labor dispute. Third one was that you don't have to pay out an employee's PTO if he or she will be returning to work. All of these things were stated in an actual email to an actual employer. You yourself may have received these guidance points. In addition, I believe the Lexington Chamber has these same quotes on their website. Those are all false. They have now come out, released this morning, file stamped on Friday, I can't get it to come down, is 787 KAR, Kentucky Administrative Regulation 1-350E for emergency. It was file stamped Friday with the LRC. I received an advance copy of it because I was the one that wrote the memo to challenge the issues that were set forth in the original employer handbook. So when this came out, I received a copy of it. It's not yet available except through this presentation. It should be available at some point today. One small caveat that I'll get to here in a second. Whoops, sorry. Salaried employees are in fact eligible. That's first. Second, the 10 to 60% reduction is based on employees' wages or salary, not the UI maximum benefit of $552 per week. Finally, PTO, and this is not part of the KAR, so bullet point shouldn't be there, it should be back. PTO is still subject to KRS Chapter 337, so the comment that says, hey, if you think you're going to bring them back to work, you don't have to pay them. If they're gone for more than 2 weeks, Kentucky Wage and Hour would disagree, and you may be hearing from the Wage and Hour Division if you don't pay out as a timely basis. All right, KAR, I'm sorry, I should say KAR, not KRA, typo on my part, trying to get that up this morning when I just got it. It is an emergency basis to implement the STC, short-time compensation or work share. It's only available for 26 weeks or 6 months. Those are pretty much equivalent. It provides to employees who have not been terminated but have experienced a reduction in work hours of more than 10%, less than 60%, no reduction in hourly rate. This is for the temporary loss of employment. You'll see here in a minute the USDOL came out with guidance brand new this morning at 9 o'clock that I've implemented as well. STC benefits means the regular weekly UI amount multiplied by the percentage of reduction. So that means 552 multiplied by the percentage of reduction. That's the amount you'll get paid if you are above 552. To become eligible, employers have to submit a plan to the executive director. He has 15 days to respond to that. It has not yet been developed because this is brand spanking new. However, it's supposed to be expedited quicker than 15 days. Key elements include continuing benefits, CBA approval if it's applicable, that's your collective bargaining agreements if you have a union, usual weekly hours in the affected unit, which is defined under the regulations that I'll share with everyone, and other provisions with regard to holidays, closed operations, and credits for retirement benefits. You must provide a certification. You're not going to hire new employees during the short-time compensation in that unit. You will not lay off or further reduce hours without submitting a new plan. You can terminate at any point in time. You can also resubmit a new plan and it can be accepted. You must provide compliance reports. The details are in the regulations as to when and how you are going to have to do that. You must follow all other directives from the executive director. And here's the kicker, you must pay 1/2 of the amount that's being paid under the plan, but it may be reimbursed. And I put in there CARES, and the reason for that is that the state has to have a contract with the U.S. Department of Labor. If that is approved and they get the money from the feds, then they will not be collecting the money from the employers. If they don't get the money from the feds, then they will be collecting 1/2 from the employers. So, U.S. Department of Labor came out with guidance this morning at 9 o'clock that I have added in. I've got the guidance, I'll drag it down here in a minute. It's on one of my screens. We may do it after the governor. Kentucky is awaiting review to determine implementation of the regulations that I just referenced above because they issued the regs on Friday, filed them with the LRC, Legislative Research Commission, then got this publication this morning, and they're unsure yet whether it complies. My review, on a brief review, it does. CARES Act provides 100% financing of the short-time compensation through December 31st. Kentucky is identified on there as being able to receive $1,253,728 towards short-time compensation. It also identifies the program as a layoff aversion program. It's to bring laid-off employees back to work or to stop employers from laying them off. It's available for those working for an employer prior to COVID-19. You can't hire somebody after and then use this as a benefit. It affirms the requirement of the employer plan that I just referenced on the previous slide, the requirement of ongoing health and retirement benefits, requirement to include the percentage of hours reduced, 26-week limitations, and so on. Does not include seasonal, intermittent, or temporary employees at all. Kentucky must reach an agreement with the Secretary of Labor pursuant to 2108 of the CARES Act. And additional information is provided on the Department of Labor website, and I'll be pulling that down after the governor's done as well. But those are the general updates. Let me see if I can grab and pull down, since I think he's going to be here any second. Thought I had it up, and it's giving me trouble getting it. There we go. 1 second, sorry.
That looks good. We all wish we were there on the beach.
On the beach. That's not really me. I joke about that. That's a stock picture almost everybody has. So that has locked up on me, Lyle. I think we're at pretty much the time the governor's going to be coming in. If anybody has questions about those areas, we may be able to answer one or two. I will tell you while we're waiting, the server's still broken. This was this morning at 6:30 or 7:30. Server's still broken at 10:15, and now we're getting error messages at 10:40. 2 different types of error messages. So if you're having difficulty with the Kentucky unemployment website, keep trying. I've been telling employers, and I've seen them and trying to assist, that we're averaging about 1 out of every 7 times when we get into the website, and right now it's locking up on a runtime code error because they are apparently trying to update, perhaps to include the work share issues, but that's the status that I have right now.
Okay. Any calls coming in?
Yeah, and the governor is ready, so here we go.
All right, great. Good morning, Governor Beshear. How are you, sir?
Uh-oh. 1 second.
Okay.
He is unmuted, so.
Yeah, Lyle, it's Andy Beshear.
Hello, Governor Beshear. How are you, sir?
I'm doing all right.
We thank you very much for joining us. We've got about 170 folks on the phone. These are all human resource experts and other business leaders from across the Commonwealth, and we're going through a lot of detail. Right now, we've been talking about unemployment, but there are things that have come down even last night that changed some things. So we kind of keep everybody up to speed, and they give us a lot of questions we answer. But, you know, you're doing a phenomenal job communicating with people, and you're trying to make sure we get back to work safely. And so we want you to take a few minutes and share with us what message you might have for employers across the Commonwealth.
Well, thank you all for letting me join you today. Let me start the way I always start, by telling you, and you know it, that we're going to get through this, and we're going to get through it together. We are facing a worldwide health pandemic that we see one in every 100 years. The last time one came through, I think it killed over 20 million people worldwide. And COVID-19 is aggressive in the way that it spreads, and it can be deadly depending on who gets it. We should not confuse the job that we have done in flattening a curve better than anyone has ever done in addressing one of these with the fact that the virus has somehow gone away. It is still there. In fact, Warren County had 254 positive tests in the last week. So it can still significantly spread, especially in specific areas anywhere around the state. But what this state has done to battle this virus is nothing short of heroic. People willing to put the lives of other people ahead of their own self-interest, and being willing to do what it takes to plateau our number of cases. We're at about 3 weeks now where we're plateaued, and now that we're testing more, our rate of new cases may even be decreasing. Now, on the other side, tougher news is the impact on long-term care facilities. This has proven to be even more deadly and aggressive in those facilities, as well as how it can spread in a prison where certainly Green River down in Muhlenberg County has been a really rough area, and how it's spreading out. So we're doing something that none of us have ever done before, which is stop a worldwide health pandemic. And then we're trying to do something now that is possibly even more challenging. And that is to go back to work, to gradually reopen our economy at a time when that worldwide health pandemic is still going on. You know, the challenge that you all are going to face now is that you reopening businesses when there is a highly contagious and even deadly virus out there. And that is why the top 10 rules that we've put out, as well as industry-specific guidance, the ones for May 11th should be up on our website about noon today, are absolutely critical. And I shouldn't say that they are guidance, they are requirements. And you know, there's going to be some instances where it doesn't seem fair, because if a business can't get the supplies they need, they might not be able to open. But if you can't get the supplies you need, it's also not safe to reopen. And again, with that perspective of us being in a worldwide health pandemic, and ensuring that if we're going to open something, we only do it in a safe way. Our plan is gradual, and it is more gradual than a couple of our neighbors, though it is more aggressive than a number of other states. But our plan is gradual for a couple of reasons. Number one, you don't want to be the most aggressive and the first against a deadly virus. That is just not a smart decision. You want to learn from those around you. If they make mistakes, those are lives in their state. I'm responsible for lives in this state. Second, we have to do it gradually, because to do this safely, we have to ramp up our testing capacity, and we have to put in place an infrastructure for contact tracing. And you all are going to be involved in all of that in a form or fashion. Yeah, when you look at what's up in the benchmarks, the testing capacity and contact tracing, personal protective equipment, which we'll talk about, and ability to protect at-risk populations are going to be some of your major challenges. Lyle, do you all have the top 10 on?
Yes, we do, right there.
So
There
if I
you go.
can talk through these, because these are going to be real challenges for you all, but it's what I hope you want to do to keep people safe. Now, the number one thing that I can really suggest to everybody, if teleworking is possible, and if it has been productive, don't bring somebody back to work just to bring them back to work. For a couple different reasons. Number one, you want to lessen the density, but number two, if they're working from home, it's where they are least likely to get infected, and you're least likely to lose a workforce member. If you go down to the special accommodations, I think my kids just walked in. If you go down to the special accommodations, especially those over 65 with heart, lung, or kidney disease, the White House suggests they still shelter in place in phase one. So special accommodations, especially on telework there, is going to be highly risky for folks that fall inside those areas to go back to work, even on the schedule that we have. Phased return. Okay, the next one, we've heard a lot about, but an on-site temperature and health check is critical. Either on-site doing it or having people do it at home and report it in. And then you need an audit procedure to make sure people aren't making up the number. This is the best opportunity we have to prevent the spread at a whole area or facility. And it's important to have the process in place where somebody comes in with a temperature, they're immediately sent to get a test. And we're working on setting up a network that you can send somebody directly to. But I'll tell you, I had a question from a local leader that says, can somebody who has a temperature, if they say it's for another reason, come into work? No. It means that they have an infection and that they are probably contagious. That's the body's way of telling you, go get tested immediately. And that's one to be really smart on. PPE and masking is important and it's mandatory. We cannot do this safely without it. If we didn't do, and for most people, it's just going to be cloth masks. You can make them at home. You can get them different places. If we didn't do that, we couldn't be doing the gradual reopening on the schedule that we're at and doing it safely. So, but we can be smart about it. If you're sitting in your office all alone, like I am right now, you don't need to be wearing one. But when you are moving around in an office, you need to be wearing one. When you're coming in, when that social distancing can lessen, you need to be wearing one. So it's just about being smart, and it's about being able to protect one another. Really think about your common areas. People may need to be able to put something in the fridge, but you need to restrict or shut them down as much as possible. Waiting rooms are where the virus spreads. Any area that you're thinking about where your employees come together, you need to limit that. And another way to do that is in the culture itself. Telework, gradual phased reopening, and limiting face-to-face meetings. People are going to want to have meetings in a conference room or somewhere else when they come back. You shouldn't. That sets up the wrong culture. Just because you're in the building doesn't mean that you ought to come together. So continuing to do meetings like this, even if it's from everybody at their desk, and doing them on the phone. And there are some leaders of business that are going to struggle with that a little bit. But you are less likely, if you follow all these rules, to have that positive test that if the rules haven't been followed, the contact tracing is going to send everybody home to self-quarantine for 2 weeks. So the rules don't just protect people's health. I think they protect the viability of the business on the model that we are gradually phasing in at this time. Sanitizers and hand washing stations are going to be really important throughout a facility. And so I just say with all this, just because you can on the 11th or on the 25th, whenever your date is, doesn't mean that you should. Make sure you're ready. Make sure that your employees are ready. You're going to need a lot of education on this and social distancing. We all fall back into our regular way of doing things when we come back to a familiar environment. And so I know for you all, especially in human resources, a lot of this is going to fall on you. So here's what I'd ask. Do your best to make good decisions and be firm about them. Trust me, I'm learning that that's not always easy and that you get different pressure out there. But the decisions and the enforcement that you make also may be the difference between life and death. And I know that's heavy, but that's what it takes when we're reopening an economy during all this. Every decision I make, even the gradual reopening, is trying to balance the risk of additional death at a time when we know we flatten that curve with getting our economy reopening. So we will have additional guidance up and using good judgments after that, knowing, and I really need you all to know that this virus is just as present on May the 11th as it has been. We have it under better control, but we are increasing people's contacts significantly. And that's why one of the hard decisions we've had is not to be able to open childcare. I would tell you, and if you didn't see our graphic, if we do that, the number of contacts goes from a person going from, say, 4 in a family of 4 to about 30 if they interact with 8 coworkers to over 1,000. And again, it's just what's safe at this time. And it was a tough. I mean, I believe in childcare. I believe childcare is necessary, but it's a challenge right now that we don't have an answer to that is safe. So Lyle, thanks for having me. To everybody out there, thanks for all your work. You are a part of Team Kentucky, and with us going back to being healthy at work, you are a more important part of Team Kentucky now than ever. We're counting on you.
Thank you, Andy. That's very helpful. And we know we all have to work together to make this thing work. And we have to be serious about it. I've asked people, are you afraid? Are you fearful of this? Because you sort of need to be motivated. You know, I've lost friends now. Once that happens, you say, this is a real thing. So we appreciate the seriousness with which you're addressing this. Are you okay with a question or two if we've got some?
I can probably take 2.
All right. Somebody wrote and asked, when do you think the government offices might open again?
So we're working on that plan. We had healthcare, we have business, and then we have government. Our hope is to have a plan out this week. That needs to look different too. You know, in government, we've got to model the type of behavior that we want to see. And I will tell you that I haven't been anywhere outside of work here and to a farm with nobody else on it for my daughter to ride a horse in the last month and a half. And so the way we go about in government has to look like the way that you're going to go about in what you're doing. I hope that we'll probably trail business by about a week in a gradual reopening.
Okay.
Governor, I've had several questions. This is Jim Morris. I've had several questions related to the on-site temperature testing, and people have asked, is it possible for them to have the employee test at home and report their testing instead of on-site? And I know that the slide that we have up says it's required on-site, but is there a possibility to keep the potential danger down to have people doing it at home?
So there is flexibility there amongst a couple conditions. First, if they're going to call in and report it, and you have to have a daily report, it's got to be audited. Because if somebody calls in and says their temperature is the exact same every single day, we know our bodies fluctuate differently than that. So there's got to be some ways to make sure that people aren't just mailing it in. But the second is, if you're going to rely on the individual, you need to have the policies in place, the paid sick leave and others, that doesn't pressure somebody into telling you something that's not true. On-site protects you the most because somebody might be feeling that pressure to come into work and they're sick. But if you can do a program that is audited, that everybody is calling in every single day, and you have those other incentives in place for people to stay home when they're sick, that'll be sufficient.
Thank you.
Good answers, and thank you.
All right, I got to drop off.
Thank you so much, Andy. Have a great day.
Sir.
We're going to keep up the fight. Okay, my team, you want to add anything to what he said or comment on any of these slides? Because we weren't sure he was going to use these slides, but we're glad he did because we thought they were pretty important. Jim?
I think that he covered these pretty well. I'm going to cover a couple of things later. There are some questions on what he meant by certain things. One of them I did not get is this testing plan, but I do have some guidance as Lyle and I have both been talking about. They were starting to suggest that each employer would have to submit a plan to the government. Now they've said, whoa, we don't want 300,000 plans. We wanted areas like interest groups, associations to present on behalf of their group. I ideas. So I know that we've gotten questions on this testing plan right here. I'm not sure what.
We can thank our Kentucky Chamber of Commerce for going to battle on that. And
Yeah.
it was a battle a week and a half ago, but it really made a difference to get that. So everybody didn't have to do their own plan. That would have been a nightmare.
And the
But
only
you need
other
a plan
thing
in your organization, you need a plan. You just don't want
yeah,
to
and
have
I
to
think
submit
that might have been what he and I just chatted about as well, when he talks about the need for if you're going to temperature test, that you're going to need a defined plan. And we're going to get into some of the detail on scanning right now. And so we'll cover that. Hopefully we'll get to some of those answers shortly.
All right, let's jump back on the schedule. You've got a lot to cover. Let's roll.
All right. So, brand new guidance on the PPP. This is this morning, hot off the presses. I don't have an answer for you, and it's a little bit scary. So the CARES Act, with the SBA's guidance, requires a comparison of your 8 weeks to the, quote, first quarter of 2020. So if you've got a PPP loan, you're supposed to use the first quarter of 2020 as your calculation. Then it says you're supposed to pay 75% of the monies you get from the federal government through the PPP during the 8-week time period in order to have it forgiven. Good, except for one thing. The first quarter had 13 weeks because of the extra day and because it's 13 weeks. So that means if you have to pay 75% of the loan toward payroll and the first quarter has 13 weeks times, whoops, that should have said the proper calculation was 75%, is 9.75 weeks. 9.75 weeks you have to pay in 8 weeks. It was not addressed by the SBA or the Treasury Department or anyone else, but let me give you this example. Employer gets a PPP loan of $40,000 based upon wages paid to 5 employees during the appropriate time period of 2019. During the first quarter, those employees were paid a total of $50,000. 75% of $50,000 is $37,500. So during the 8 weeks, the employees receive $29,000. The remainder goes to health insurance and state unemployment taxes. Under the current guidance from the SBA, $8,500 of the loan will not be forgiven, even though all $40,000 was expended, because they didn't spend enough on payroll. So the problem here is you've got a lot of confusion out there, and that actually probably was 2,500. Sorry, this was brand new this morning, trying to run calculations, came out at 9 o'clock, and I apologize for the typos, I see them. Problem here is that it was never intended to be this stringent. There's a lot of push right now to get the SBA to change its guidelines. They say 75%. But then they come back later and they say, and I was trying to find where I had it. Here we go. It talks about, and this is in the SBA, it talks about the type of calculations, and it's a recommendation. 75% is an appropriate percentage in light of the Act's overarching focus on keeping workers paid and employed. Applying this threshold to the loan forgiveness is consistent with the structure of the Act, which provides a loan amount, 75% of which is equivalent to 8 weeks of payroll. But that's not what they then did when they said use the first quarter. This came off of the federalregister.gov business loan program. Information will be available after the meeting if you want a copy of that. It's too much to put into a slide, and it's 36 pages long. And then the guidance this morning that I told you about earlier, I do want to jump back to that for a second. Well, let me get through the rest of this slide, then we'll jump back. Each lending institution, we cover this in week 5 and 6, the lending institution that you utilize to get your PPP makes the final determination as to compliance and loan forgiveness. So you need to contact your own provider, your own lending institution, to figure out what they're going to require, because they make the decision for the SBA. This is going to get more and more bizarre, because now you have 300,000 banks across the country that are making decisions on whether something is or is not forgiven under one program with the SBA. You're going to have multiple people being treated completely differently by different institutions, and none of them have any guidance on what's right under the law. So look for the SBA to come out with more guidance. I would look for them to loosen the constraints on 75%. I've seen a lot of restaurants and small businesses indicating there's no way we can pay people right now 8 weeks or 9.75 weeks right now while we're still closed by governor ordinance until at least May 11th or May 20th or June 1st, depending on what type of business you run. So it puts people in a predicament. If you've received your PPP, the law says you have 8 weeks upon receipt to spend that money. Early on, I gave some guidance that I could not imagine the government would require us to do that, and I expected them to come out with guidance. It's been 3 weeks since I said that. No guidance has come out. So you're a little bit on your own. I would contact your lending institution, get it in writing from somebody, because it might be somebody else that reviews your loan forgiveness request later. But do contact them, because it's a little bit of the wild, wild west right now. Let me go back for a second. I wanted to cover the guidance today. I'm going to shrink this down, sorry. The guidance today, here's your unemployment insurance from the Department of Labor, issued this morning at 9 o'clock. If you click on the full contents of it, the description is right here. And it is several pages long to our state government for them to comply with. I'm just going to scroll through so that you see what we're trying to read every morning, because this is the type of guidance that comes out on a daily basis. And it's about 20 pages long. The last thing was someone asked about the amount Kentucky can receive, short-time compensation. This actually is part of that same, this document here has, this document has attached the grants amounts. They have $100 million total. Kentucky's portion of that is right here, based upon 2/3, 1/3, and the total amount. That's the total amount that they're entitled to. So that's the guidance that goes back to the first slide that I had about the USDOL and the reason why Kentucky's sitting on its regulations for a couple of days.
And that's the total amount for the whole state.
Only on the short-time compensation, and I expect the government will probably add to that. But yes, there was $100 million added to the part-time working. In other words, the work share between 10% and 60% reduction in an employee's time and commensurate salary or wages. The government only gave $100 million. That's part of the reason why the Kentucky regulation also has the employer having to pay in 1/2 of that amount, and that's only eligible for 26 weeks or 6 months, and all of it must be used by December 31st, and then that goes away. So yes, that's the only amount to Kentucky right now, $1.25 million, rough figures. So the next question, I've gotten a whole bunch of questions from you all about temperature scanning. We covered this in, actually I covered this in week 1 with my crisis management plan. Talked about the fact that this is only available during a pandemic. I'm going to say that again, and I'm also going to throw in the caveat I throw in every week. This changes day by day. You just saw that with the calculations. You just saw that with the DOL. This is the guidance as it was last night and this morning when I did my double checks on everything. So, questions have been asked. Are professional office buildings required to take temperatures and conduct health screenings when employees return to work? Answer to that is not unless you control the whole building. Each individual office is required to perform temperature scanning under the governor's current directives. I'm a little concerned because and this is not a slight on the governor at all. Please understand he's drinking from a fire hose, so am I. So he said that if you have the appropriate safeguards entered with the appropriate policies and procedures to test at home, then you may have your employees do that. I've not seen any of that guidance out there. So right now I have to go on something from the governor's office that's published that says the following 10 things. I'm going to go back to those. You must comply with all 10 of these in order to have anyone working. And one of those is on-site temperature and health checks. I don't believe that simply because, and it's again, no slight, I don't believe simply because the governor got on a webinar and said, you can do this at home. I don't know how much I would put on that until there's a regulation from the governor's office that says, and this is how you do it. Right now, it literally says the only way you can open to match these time periods is if you meet each one of these requirements: on-site, phased return, universal masks and other PPE, and we're going to cover that question that someone had as well. But I don't have any guidance to give you on the at-home, so I just wanted to let you know, be concerned about that. So the question that's asked next, this one, can you self-administer before coming in? This was on here as of 9 o'clock this morning. I know what he just said. Use that at your own discretion because it requires on-site temperature scanning. That's what I went with in our slides. Who should conduct an on-site thermal scan? We covered this in week 4 and week 3, but I'm going to cover it again because it becomes more and more clear. I highly recommend when I'm acting as a retained general counsel that you use a third-party provider. Or if you can't afford or cannot locate right now, human resources. Why? You can't have a supervisor or a coworker do these, because if a coworker or supervisor finds out confidential, proprietary, HIPAA, or any other type of information about that employee, you can be sued because it happened during a workplace setting in a required question and answer. For example, wow, Joe, you have a fever of 100.5. I'm going to have to send you home. No, I don't have a fever. I have cancer, and this is part of my cancer treatment. Well, now the supervisor knows that Joe has cancer, and they're not allowed to know, and now any decision that's ever made could come back to the fact that Joe has cancer. So that could be an ADA violation, and you could get sued for that. That's why you don't want anyone in the line of succession hierarchy of supervisory to have anything to do whatsoever. The reason why you don't have a coworker do it is the privacy as well as the competency. Whoever's giving these tests must know how to use the equipment. Most of the equipment is no longer touching the forehead. We recommend it be 4 inches from the forehead, but now you have someone within someone's private space within the 6-foot social distancing mandate, and they are exposing themselves to potential COVID. 2 reasons I use a third party. One, it's a third party, meaning you don't get sued because they voluntarily took on this hazard pay. Second, you don't have any problem of any of the confidential proprietary question or confidential questions, HIPAA and so on, because you're assigning it to someone who specializes in these questions. So if you do that, you limit your exposure as an HR person, you limit your exposure as an employer. Baseline temperature. This is a really good question. I had no clue what the answer was, so the best answer I could find, and it's not recent, it was at the beginning of this, and by recent, I mean I'm looking for things in the last 3 days. No guidance in the last 3 days, no guidance in the last 3 weeks. The guidance is from the CDC, and the CDC guidance has not changed as a part of COVID. I thought it might. If you found it, great, let me know. But this is what I found on their website. related to COVID is it considers a fever a measured temperature of 100.4 degrees Fahrenheit or greater. So that's what they consider. Now, if you're tracking a log, and we're going to get into that next page, if you do a log and you see a spike, then you must act on it even if it doesn't meet the CDC guidelines, because your whole purpose of keeping a log is to verify that there are no increases. I suspect by the end of the day today or tomorrow that Kentucky will come out with more guidance on what does constitute a temperature under Kentucky. Hopefully they will follow the CDC guidelines, because I think coming up with something over 98.3, 98.6 is going to be a problem. I think you have to have a fluctuation, as the governor indicated, because you fluctuate day to day, hour to hour, and minute to minute. So that's the guidance. How long should an employee be required to remain away from a facility? I could not find a specific answer on temperature. However, the answer I found was on anyone that is sent away due to a suspected COVID-19, including spiked temperature. And the answer is, from the EEOC, OSHA, CDC, and the DOL, all, you have the opportunity as an employer to require your employee to have a return to work designation, but you should not require it on any specific formal form because of the issues related to doctors trying to treat other patients. So you should accept a med clinic note, you should accept something that's looser than a doctor-physician note or a primary care provider, but you can require that they have an appropriate notification that they are not COVID-19 positive. One other thing I'll point out, it's not in any of the slides, I talked about it last week, but you can now test for COVID-19 as part of allowing people into the building if that's something you want to incur the expense of, or you want to send them to one of the free locations or one of the reduced locations and have them tested. All right, should an employer, and we talked about this a little bit, retain daily temperature scan information and daily documentation that certifies those that enter the building that they have no symptoms or exposure? The answer is yes, you may do so. You must track any spikes in temperature if you take on that obligation, and that tracking must be confidential or in a medical file. Remember, I've mentioned from week one, red file, med file, keep those separate from personnel files. You cannot commingle any medical information into someone's background, because then if you make a decision, it may be assumed that you knew about the medical condition and made a decision that was illegal under the law. On this tracking, the one thing I want to make sure everybody understands, this gets into the hyper legal technical, but you need to know this. If you track, because you're taking on that added responsibility. It's kind of like shoveling the sidewalk out front. If a sidewalk out front is covered in snow, anybody walking on that sidewalk is deemed to take on the added risk of walking on that sidewalk because it's covered in snow. If you shovel it and you don't clear it sufficiently and somebody slips and falls, they had a right to believe you took adequate steps to shovel the driveway, the sidewalk, and you didn't do so, they can sue you. So same kind of thing here. If you take on that responsibility, which you are supposed to do, make darn sure you do it right, because if you take it on and you don't do it right, you're going to get sued by a customer, by a coworker, something, because you didn't adequately document the steps taken. So keep that in mind. Question was asked, will the essential businesses that are open now be required to follow the governor's new mandates of having daily medical questionnaires? I'm unaware of any medical questionnaires having to be completed. I am aware of the temperature scans going back to what he required on the 10 steps, and I expect those to be fleshed out. But I do not have anything in the 10 steps that talks about a specific medical questionnaire every day. There are some steps taken to try to protect your health, safety, and welfare, but there is nothing related to the actual daily questions. That was something that we thought was going to be in there. That's where we talked about the Kentucky Chamber kind of changing things. So the next question on there is, where is the guidance on cubicle setups? It's funny because it's not where it was, and that's where they're bouncing things around, and that's, like I said, it changes daily. It was on the EEOC, now it's on OSHA. I put it up there as to where I found this guidance. It talks about some of the cubicles. There was some other guidance on the EEOC on a safe opening, but they kind of moved it and I can't find it. It was more clear than this, but it is not mandatory. It is guidance. You do not have to have, we talked about 8-foot section between cubicles. The specific question was, I have 8 feet. Is that sufficient? Everything you do right now in the business is trying to keep to the guidelines the best you can. You may not be able to. It's kind of like plexiglass between a cashier and a customer. It's not perfect. It doesn't go to the ceiling, but you're trying to protect the best you can. It is guidance. Last one's the best one on this one. There are more questions, so if you asked them and I haven't gotten to them, there's one more page of questions, and then of course we'll have the FAQs if we have time. This one is a really good question, and I've been asked this as retained counsel multiple times. The answer is yes, 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 you can, but you must do it equally. Question is, should COVID-19 precautions be made mandatory? Can they be made mandatory? Are you able to enforce them as mandatory? The answer is yes, yes, and yes. Employees can be disciplined for refusing or failing to adhere to CDC and Kentucky guidelines. So if you put in place that there must be social distancing, no one is allowed to be within 6 feet, no one is allowed to sit at the same table, and somebody goes in and starts hugging someone else, you can take appropriate action. I wouldn't fire them. I would caution them unless they are a serial hugger and they keep doing it. But if you do that, you have to do it for everyone, and that means the one person in the office that everybody loves to have a hug from, you can't accept them from the policy. Uniformity, I always talk about the golden rule, treat every single person exactly the same regardless of how you feel about them or how everybody else feels. But yes, you have the opportunity and the outright obligation under CDC and Kentucky guidance to discipline those employees who do not adhere to your mandated rules, but you must have policies in place. If you haven't done your policies, we talked about it last week, we talked about it in week 1, we talked about it in week 3. You need well-written HR policies. You need to have a review done by experts that know what they're doing on your work from home, your transition to work, your work safety, all of those things. So it's not a plug for me. If you have an attorney, great, go contact your attorney, but you need to make sure you have that protected, because as soon as you start bringing customers into your workplace and you bring employees back, if someone gets sick and you don't have a policy, you're going to wish that you had paid a little bit up front compared to the whole bunch of attorney's fees afterwards to try to defend against it. Sorry. All right, additional questions about the pandemic, not necessarily related to the temperature and other safety and security. One of the questions I got, and I've gotten a lot of these, how are independent contractor unemployment requests being handled? Our system is broken. I could drag it down again and show it to you. It's really broken. It's seriously broken, and don't look at the handbook because the handbook for employers is wrong. They have said they're going to pull that down and put up a new one. They've not yet done it. Best guidance I can give you is what I've done for a couple of the companies that I'm providing the counsel for, and that is if you answer it, if you're identified as the employer, write back that they are an independent contractor, provide the position description and the type of services that they provided. According to the UI office, the KUIC, Kentucky Unemployment Insurance Commission, employers' reserve accounts are not being charged. I am awaiting additional guidance. I was supposed to get it this morning, but when the USDOL came out, they pulled back and said they weren't going to talk to me until this afternoon. because of the pointed questions I had last week. They don't really want to answer until they have their guidance in place. That's my own assumption. Independent contractors. If you have not yet submitted yours, identify yourself as the employer, not wherever you're working. After all, what if you're working for 20 different companies as an independent contractor? You can't list them all. They should not have listed you as the employer of record, but if they have, then the question becomes, if you rejected, they are delayed on the handling of their claim. At this point in time, it does not seem to matter who is the employer of record because nobody's going to be paying for this. Up until the end of the pandemic or July 31st, it appears that everybody's getting a free pass on unemployment without a hit on your SUTA rate. So contact them as the employer. Good luck getting through because it's been fun. But if you can get through, get it in writing, because I bet there's probably half of you out there that have reached out to them. They are not going to give one-off guidance anymore because I shared with them the multiple answers that each of my customers had been receiving and said, you are treating all of these employers completely differently without guidance and without explanation, and that's unconstitutional. They acknowledged that. They could not believe the amount of information that's floating out there as people are trying to answer individuals' questions, and they're trying to rein that in. But make sure you get guidance from them in writing because you don't want to get hit with it later on that you didn't ask the right questions. Next one's unrelated to that, but it's under the PPP. Is overtime part of the calculation? As we kind of talked about in the first slide, you're kind of screwed on the PPP right now. The answer is yes, because last year's calculations included any wages, tips, overtime, and other sources. So in paying out, it still includes wages, tips, overtime, and other sources. So the problem is you're not paying overtime, but it goes into the 75% calculation, and you also have to deal with the 9.75 weeks instead of 8 weeks because of the first quarter. So that's where I put in here. Also, keep in mind you cannot have more than 25% drop. Next, if we are eligible for phase 1 opening but do not have appropriate personal protective equipment, do our employees lose eligibility? The answer is no, absolutely not. You cannot open without the appropriate PPE. Your employees cannot work unless you have the appropriate PPE, and you will not be punished, and neither will your employees if you continue to have them staying at home or remote working. In fact, as you heard the governor indicate, and as set forth in the slides, it literally says in the recommendation, phase return to work, mandatory masks and other PPE. So you can't have them return to work unless and until you actually have the ability to do so in a safe manner. So I've got a few other things I want to cover, and it will not take very long, hopefully. All right, May 1st, Friday, OSHA announced intent to provide industry-specific guidance. The first one they covered was restaurants. I wanted to cover this as well because I know there's a lot of employers probably on this call where they are trying to figure out how to do business. They came out with guidance. It's on their website. I thought I'd put it on this. The rest of them I have on here. It's kind of gets redundant, so you'll notice on the rest of these I just put it on one page because it's kind of common sense to figure out how to do it for each industry. Except for the meat and poultry, you need to go to theirs because it's like 6 pages long. I do have the link on the next page. But here's the main guidance, and you'll see this is pretty much what I've been telling you for 4 weeks now. Encourage them to stay home if they're sick. Avoid direct handoff between the customer and the employee. Display a door or sidewalk sign with the services available, including instructions. Reserve parking spots near the front for curbside. Train your workers on proper hygiene. Allow them to wear masks, which really kind of surprised me because it should be mandate them to wear masks. At least in Kentucky it is, but under OSHA it is allow. Provide a place to wash your hands. Alcohol must have at least 60% alcohol if you're using that. and I don't mean drinking alcohol. Routinely clean and disinfect surfaces with an EPA-approved cleaning chemicals, and they actually had the specific type. I didn't include it on here. Go to the website if you need the specific type. Practice sensible social distancing, 6-foot markers on the floor, tape if it's inside pickup, move workstations, et cetera, et cetera. Same guidance that I gave on the EEOC a couple of weeks ago, and encourage everyone to report any health or safety, which is what the OSHA puts on everything they ever publish, just so they'll tattletale. Yes, that's my own personal comment. OSHA guidance for other industries, meat and poultry. If you're in the meat and poultry, take a look at it because it goes into all kinds of things, including restructuring your factory lines, putting people on one side instead of both sides, separating them by 6 feet, plexiglass, all the different types of things we talked about, but it actually has little pictures of people and how to do it. Construction workforce, manufacturing workforce, package delivery workforce, and retail workforce. They have published separate ones, and they're going to come out with additional as the day goes on today. Some of these, I think, came out on Saturday. One came out, I believe, on Sunday. I was going to put them in, but then it got so redundant. I just put the links in, and you can go check them out for yourself. CDC has additional guidance. Sometimes those don't combine, they don't collaborate with one another. And right now, I believe CDC dictates over all other agencies under a pandemic declaration. But if you can comply with both, OSHA is more employer specific, so I would not suggest you just ignore them. So social distancing, pretty much all of these social distancing, plexiglass if possible, stagger your work areas, stagger your work schedules, and do any other efforts possible to encourage a safe and healthy work environment. Additional guidance on respirators. On week 5, I gave guidance that they had just announced. They came out with more this past week. I want to put this out there because I know we're running low on PPE, especially on the N95 masks. So the National Institute Occupational Safety and Health, I think is what that is, came out with guidance, and OSHA has adopted that, not as final, but as interim guidance. You can use vaporous hydrogen peroxide, ultraviolet germicidal irradiation, and or moist heat, including through an oven. If you're not able to do those, the following may be suitable. And they are microwave generated steam or liquid hydrogen peroxide. The ones that are not allowed are why I put this on here, because we talked about if you try to reuse PPE, make sure you do it in what you believe is a safe way. This additional guidance is something you're expected to follow. You cannot autoclave, you cannot dry heat, you cannot use isopropyl alcohol, soap, dry microwave irradiation, chlorine bleach, disinfectant wipes, or ethylene oxide, ETO. Those are not considered equivalent, and so you cannot utilize those. That's the current guidance this week. That's the end.
All right, Jim, thank you so much. I don't know if it's clear to everybody, but you are on the cutting edge of so much of this, and they don't know, but he actually got a letter of apology from the unemployment organization. And so he's just pushing all of your questions, keep us motivated. And we're talking to people wherever we need to talk to them to clarify things and get the best answers we can for you. And he probably would have said this time, he just said it so many times, you can't hold him to everything here. We're getting it as fast as we can and as accurate as we can. And if we get it wrong, we'll clarify it as quickly as we can. I'm loving all the questions that are coming in and all the comments and a lot of good feedback. So Allison, you want to, any questions there you want to present, or Chase, anybody else?
Yes, so we've had this question from a couple of different people. So if you are already open, do you still have to comply with the 10 directives from the governor, or is that just for the essential businesses that are now reopening?
You know, he does not spell out, and I don't mean this he, the governor's office. He has a whole cabinet of which Jim Gray from last week is a member of the COVID-19 task force. The COVID-19 task force is the one coming up with these. I'm going to put them up on the screen, so bear with me while I'm flipping up there. It does not indicate who this does or does not apply to, but this was done in accordance with this Healthy at Work initiative. My belief is that the essential businesses currently operating are supposed to already have in place their protective steps, and they are not necessarily being required to backstep to these. There are certain things you cannot do in your essential companies. Now, if you are, I'm going to use the grocery store. You'll notice if you've gone to any, they do have the plexiglass up between the customer and the cashier. If you can do that, and you can do that in a way that can protect your employees, you need to try to do that. But this talks about reopening and a Healthy at Work initiative that does not seem to apply to the pre-existing essential business designations, but I would be careful not complying simply because you're supposed to. You're supposed to be as healthy as possible, as protective as possible, and ultimately this is going to turn into your workers' comp or your customer exposure, and if you don't take the reasonable steps, you're going to get hit with it. And now that the governor's come out with this, if you don't comply with something that is across the board directives, then you don't have the ability to hold that up and say, look, we complied with all of these things, and in front of a jury, they're going to look at this and go, how hard would it have been for you to do whatever? And trust me, you'll have an attorney that will say, look, a piece of plexiglass would have cost them $5, and 2 drill holes would have cost them $2, and 2 bolts would have cost them 50 cents, and they would have been able to protect the customer, but they thought their profits were more important than protecting the customer, and so they didn't spend that $12.50, and now the person's been injured, and they put that ahead of COVID-19. You don't want to be sitting in a courtroom with a jury in front of you with that type of argument. So.
Fair. Would you recommend employees sign a release for temperature checks?
They don't have to right now, and you can't require it later. So under the pandemic, CDC rules comply. You're under a state guidance right here that you're required to do a temperature check. So the answer is you could require it, and if they refuse, then they don't work. Then you could submit that to unemployment to say that they're not entitled to unemployment benefits because they refused to comply with a mandatory obligation. At this point in time only, during a pandemic, the CDC dictates, and they have said that you must be temperature checked. Once the pandemic is lifted, and I can't emphasize this enough, do not continue with your temperature checks once you're told by CDC, OSHA, and EEOC that you can no longer do so, or the governor, because you will be subject to some type of lawsuit, class action, or otherwise, because it is a physical examination to take someone's temperature. So right now, you are not required to have a release. If you get one, it's a release to work, basically, because if they don't do it, they are not allowed under the governor's mandates to even return to work. So that's the type of release you have right now. Later on, you will not be allowed to ask them to sign a release to obtain their temperature because it's illegal to do so unless there's a pandemic.
Right, and we've clearly talked a lot about on-site temperature checks for employees. What is allowed or encouraged in regards to people coming in that are not employees, vendors, customers, clients?
You know, it's interesting because that's what I wanted to ask but I didn't want to put the governor on the spot with something that I believe we're going to have to get more guidance on. You'll notice my laser point's still on on-site temperature and health checks. It does not indicate that that on-site temperature and health check is employee only. And it's an interesting question, and I put out there like Kroger. Nobody's checking temperatures going into Kroger right now. I do know that they are doing some heat sensors now at the airports. I used to travel 4 to 5 times a week, and I was wondering when they would do that. It was announced yesterday. It's at a couple of facilities, and they're planning on expanding it. As part of the security check, they're mandating people go through a heat sensor, and if they draw a temperature of above 100.4, they will not be able to board without further inquiry and investigation, because they're trying to stop any of the spread of the virus. So I don't know right now whether this extends to customers. And, you know, I'm going to give another example, which is we have told retail customers that we've served as general counsel for to not have a case-by-case basis of like trying to arrest somebody for trying to pickpocket, I'm sorry, to steal or to walk out with some type of product, because that means you are having a non-security person, non-specialist engage in making that decision, and you could get sued. So now you're going to do this where, unless you have a professional checking it, if you have employees making a decision on customers having a temperature, who's making that decision? And what type of information are they obtaining from a customer? And how many of the customers are going to be willing to come back to your location? It's a very confusing time. There's not a lot of guidance out there on customer protection or protection from customers. Stand by, because I suspect before May 11th, we're going to have a full-blown directive from the governor's office. And when that comes out, then it won't be your decision. It'll be mandatory across the board for all businesses having scans done of customers, and they will talk about the proper manner of doing so or whether you're allowed to do so. But I suspect that you're going to see some changes probably by Wednesday or Thursday of this week on that specific topic. And to the extent that any of your questions about the testing plan or this health check, the health check comment, the one that my bullet is right here, I believe that that is a leftover from what we talked about, where the Kentucky Chamber went in and said you can't possibly require us to have a full-blown questionnaire every day and a full-blown plan presented to you every day for every business before we get open and so on. And so I don't know, the way that I interpreted that health check is, if you go back to week 1 with my crisis management plan, and week 2 where I talked about in a essential business how you need to handle it, this is where you do the temperature check and you don't automatically send them back to the parking lot, but you have follow-up questions, and that's where you may find out the person has cancer, that the person naturally runs high. Hey, my natural temperature is 100, here's the thing from my doctor, or some other thing that causes them to have a temperature that's not COVID-19 related. So the follow-up questions are what happens. You do your screening, everybody's going in, 97, 97.6, 98.6, 99.1. Here's 100.4. You pull them aside. What's going on? Do you feel sick? Is there a reason why you might have a temperature? Do you have another explanation? That should be done by somebody who is not potentially in the line of supervisory control of that employee. Those are the follow-up health checks.
We've had people ask if you could have your risk manager do that or your HR people do that.
Yeah, so that's why I mentioned earlier, you could have HR. That's my second choice, because HR would be someone who typically maintains your RedMed file, which is the separate file you have to have If somebody asks off for FMLA leave, I'm pregnant, I have cancer, I'm having a surgery, nobody else is allowed to know any of that. So you have your HR people already have access to that. They're supposed to maintain it in a separate red folder, is my color of choice, some folder that's separate from their personnel. So HR clearly is a good way to go. A third-party HR, and this is not a plug for Hanna, but it is pointing out that a third-party HR has no involvement with promotional decisions other than to provide the rate of pay and information. Typically, they may be involved, but typically they're not. That would be a great choice to have somebody like that. But then, you know, to Hanna, my guidance would be, okay, now, you've got to make sure you have somebody that's competent and capable, able to take a temperature check, knows how to maintain their own health and safety, and understands the risks of going into it, because you may not want to have Allison, Chase, or Autumn go in and take the temperatures because they may not be qualified to do temperature checks. So there's risk all over. The other one, risk manager. My only concern with risk manager, I deal with a lot of risk managers when I'm retained as counsel. Those risk managers are sometimes involved in the communications with me about, hey, Joe Smith is suing us for discrimination. Here's what I think, and here's what I've done, and here's how things went. Sometimes they cross that line and they're involved with the legal defense in a risk management. How much money are we going to set aside? Well, you know, I know what's going on with this person, so I think that, you know, they're probably not going to stick with a lawsuit long term, so we put aside X amount for the legal fees. If you're a risk manager and you're involved in that decision making on a legal front, then you need to be careful about engaging in too much information sharing on the HIPAA, and you'd have to make sure that you never share that information with legal counsel, ownership, shareholders, managers, or anyone else if you are involved in that screening. So you can do it, but you'd have to make sure you only keep on your HR hat and you don't get involved in your risk management legal side. I don't want to pay this person, so let me tell you what else they did, and so on and so forth. Keep that in check.
So we have someone who's following up with that question. What about a safety manager? Maybe the safety manager does the temperature check, but follow-up questions come from HR.
I've had safety managers involved all the way through at the plant that started this for me 8.5 weeks ago now. They took the firefighters for the location and said, you guys are going to do temperature. Now, I stepped in and said, we need to slow down a little bit because they didn't sign up. While they do sign up for hazard pay, they didn't sign up for this type of hazard. So we had to go through and do a little bit more screening to verify that they were competent, capable, had the proper EMT training and so on, and that was part of their job function while they're on site. But a safety manager could handle the whole thing. If they're having the logs, they hold the logs. They don't have to become part of the medical file. They can if you want, but if they do, that's all maintained confidentially. Safety manager could hand off the follow-up questions to HR, but that means HR has to have their rep sitting there at the table scanning and taking those one-on-one every time somebody has a temperature, taking those questions. It's okay. My preference is a third party. And again, my preference is a third party because, especially if money's not an object, and I know that everybody's laughing at that right now, but if you assign a third party and the third party screws up, the third party's at fault. You get an indemnification contract with them where they indemnify you, hold you harmless. You're sure they have insurance that covers this. If they do something and they accidentally release somebody's temperature records or health background, they have to indemnify you. If your risk manager goes out there and says to the supervisor, man, you wouldn't believe what so-and-so told me in the line, you're in trouble. So that's why I always think it's better to outsource if at all possible. Sometimes you can't, and I get that. but I'm talking about best case scenario.
And then we had an employee question about what PPE would be required for those taking temperature checks. So I've been trying to look for an OSHA standard that we can pass along.
Yeah.
To you.
I dealt with this 8 weeks ago, and I fought for it because the comment was, we don't want any of our employees to be afraid to come to work, so we don't want to have any PPE. We want them just to take the temperature. Legally, my answer was, with all due respect, hell no. You have to have some modicum of protection. My recommendation was I would use a full hazmat suit because they had them available. Because that's the best protection for the person that's standing in front of hundreds of people taking a temperature over and over and over again. You may not have a hazmat suit available, so this may not apply to you, but you do have available to you appropriate PPE. It doesn't take much to have a mask. Doesn't take much to have goggles. It doesn't take much to have a cloth cover for their clothing. So my recommendation to them was the best mask available, the best protective gear available, at a minimum, goggles, facial mask, because they can expose one another. They're within the 6-foot social distance, and now you have CDC guidance that blew away any attempt to undo my recommendation at the time to that organization, because at that time there was no guidance. I gave the guidance that I knew would be in there, and now the guidance is caught up. The guidance is, if you're within 6 feet, you darn well better take whatever measures you have. They're not going to tell you you have to do something, but if you're needlessly exposing an employee to a known risk, that's a problem. So if you have masks, they're cheap. You can get renewable ones. You can now use surgeon masks. You don't have to use a respirator N95. So you have the ability to use surgical masks. You have the ability to use homemade. You have the ability to go on Amazon and buy the ones that are washable and reusable. They don't meet the standards of OSHA, but you can use the moist heat and all the different things that they talk about in there. You can require your employees to do the same. If you have goggles or glasses and you have a mask, if you can find a jacket or something that they wear that gets sprayed off with Lysol and reused every half an hour to an hour, great. You've done your reasonable steps. The CDC has right in it the type of things that you need to do. Don't require people within 6 feet. If they are, require a mask, require gloves, use plexiglass, use different materials. You can set up a plexiglass reach around with the scanning device. The next thing is the scanning device needs to be wiped off between each and every person. That was another step that we had to go through 8 weeks ago. One of the recommendations, and I believe it finally got implemented, was find a heat scan one time, and you're going to be a heck of a lot better off with a computer telling you the temperature is above 100 degrees than you are forcing somebody to stand there and look at every single person within 2 feet or 1 foot of their face. So that's the general recommendation. They're not going to give you specific temperature check recommendations. They just give you the 6-foot parameter, and if you force them within that, gloves, mask, and I'm sorry, I should have mentioned gloves, obviously. Use your rubber glove throwaways, wipe off the temperature scanner. Use a temperature scanner that's 4 inches from the forehead, not touching the forehead if you can do that. If you have to use one that touches the forehead, you better buy all the disposable rubber little indicators or wipe it off in between every single person with bleach wipes to protect. Use common sense is basically what it's telling you on all of those OSHA. And if you want specific, go to the OSHA retail establishment one that I had up on the screen, because I believe that one talks about proper measures. I think several of them do, but this retail workplace one has measures on it with regard to how to open a retail establishment.
Okay, we've had a couple of employees ask about if we have any recommendations. So if you all want to check in the chat, I did post a link to a third party that we know does offer medical professionals for temperature checks. We have not worked with them yet, but we are aware of other companies that have, so please check that out. And then also
Yeah.
we have a question about employers and how to handle employees who refuse to take or submit to tests or masks. I think Jim covered this pretty thoroughly. You can discipline them. If you're requiring them to do so, you can discipline them.
Yep. During the CDC pandemic, you have an obligation to protect the rest of your employees. If one employee refuses to allow you to protect the rest of the employees, you have the opportunity to discipline or terminate that employee. Technically, they're not going to be entitled to unemployment. However, as we've heard on different things, unemployment's not catching up even with people who voluntarily quit because they just are going to make more money. But they will catch up and require them to, quote unquote, reimburse the government of the monies they received that they weren't entitled to. Some of that's just going to wash through. But the other thing is there are policies and guidelines that I've had to write for different companies. I would highly recommend you have a policy in doing the temperature checks because, hypothetical again, it's always the bad apple that does this, but if somebody's a buddy with somebody else and they just want to make sure that they're allowed to work, they're going to send them in at 100.5. And what if you never knew it, but they knew it, and the person says, yeah, I went in, but I was allowed in, and then they expose your workforce. So whatever you do, you have to have set out. If it's 99 and above, we're going to ask you follow-up questions. If it's 100.4, automatically you're not allowed to enter until you get a return to work. Anybody who violates this will be subject to disciplinary action, including but not limited to termination. And you have to have both, and this is what we did. We had to have testing policies and employee policies. If you are one that's turned away, here's how you come back to work. Here are the steps you have to take. Here's the location you have to go to. We sent them to our workers' comp carrier, MedFirst clinic, and that they then ran the tests and said, nope, no COVID-19. You're allowed to go back. Here's your letter saying that you're allowed to go back. We paid for it. Now that's one employer, and that's how they handled it. Different employers will handle it differently, but you need to make sure you have a policy, and that's why I keep trying to stress to everybody, make sure you get guidance. You need legal guidance before you open your doors because you're running the risk of exposing not only your employees, but any customers that come in. If you have taken the appropriate measures and steps and somebody still gets exposed, chances are you're going to be okay because they knew the risk. It's kind of like the walking out in the snow. They know that this is a known risk out in the general public. As long as you don't have a massive explosion because you didn't do anything, you didn't wipe down, you didn't have hand sanitizer out, you didn't follow the CDC and the state guidelines, if you do things and you can document what you've done and you have a well-established and followed policy, then you're going to be okay, 9 times out of 10. If you don't have that and you haven't sought any guidance from someone, that's when you're going to get burned and you're going to be sitting there at a table in the courtroom going, I really wish I'd have listened to that attorney and done something a little bit more than just ignoring it. So take the steps now, write a policy now, train your employees on it, the appropriate way to do it, and follow the policy. The worst thing, it's actually, this is going to sound odd, but this is what I tell everybody that I work for. You're better off not having a policy and not following anything than to have this incredibly awesome policy that your attorney wrote that's out there and you never followed it. Because then the plaintiff's attorney has this great, awesome policy that they get to use as their big poster in front of the jury, and then they get to go down through the checklist going, and you didn't do this, and you didn't do this, and you didn't do this, but it is your policy that you wrote and you didn't follow it. So if you do one, you better make sure you follow all of it, because that's what the attorneys are looking for, are those little gaps where you didn't follow it. Look at last week with Walmart. We talked about the lawsuit. I'm not saying that they didn't do it, but the lawsuit is that they didn't take appropriate measures to safeguard the health and safety and welfare of their employees because they didn't have a crisis policy and they didn't enforce the policy uniformly, and 2 employees died as a result. You don't want that at your place of employment, so you have to have a good policy and you need to follow whatever policy you have.
Jim, thank you so much for answering all these questions. We're about at the final time here, and we have a couple of slides we wanted to run through quickly. People are calling every day asking us questions, and so we're got lists of things. These are some of the ones that we've turned over the most often. Buffalo Trace is still doing the hand sanitizer and giving you a good deal on them, I think. That we've got the masks, gee whiz. We put Tempur Sealy on here, but just before the call, they said, we are kind of swamped with these things, but you know, it's good news and bad news. They're swamped because people are starting to buy mattresses again all of a sudden, so they need people to make mattresses. But boy, they have done so many, they've done thousands of these to donate. So they gave Kentucky Habitat for Humanity, they're giving them 3,500 of them. All of our convention and visitor bureaus are getting 1,600 of them. They're doing some great things across the state just to help organizations, but they actually are making washable 2-ply masks. I encourage you to look into that. There are some other providers of those because it's a lot cheaper than going through those ones that you have to throw away every day or twice a day. And you know, seems like some doctors are saying that they're pretty good. So if they're not in high contact areas and they're, you know, just working together in an area where they're not all near each other and so forth, those are pretty good masks. We've also got some resources down here for gloves and other sanitizer. And the Kentucky Chamber is even getting in the business. And they're going to have a mask. They just put that out over the weekend. And so the Chamber is going to have some resources for getting masks. Want to hit the next slide? We've got quite a few other kind of resources on here that we think might be helpful, including the OSHA posters and so forth. A lot of things important there if you need. And then the last slide is, you know what, we've had quite a few calls from employers asking us about mental health resources. People that work in mental health clinics around the area have to have a special certification so they can do stuff over the phone. So they can do Zoom kind of calls, but I know many of them have gone out and gotten that since this started. So a lot of the mental health service providers around here have got some really, you know, well-trained people, and now they're agile enough to use phone and so forth, Zoom kind of things. But these are kind of interesting that Yale University is offering a course that's a popular course for them, but more popular now, Science of Well-Being. And another one also by this other organization on mindfulness. We thought those are kind of fun, so we're sharing those with you. I hope that those might be resources that you'll find helpful. We told you we'd be off now. There's some things I really think need to be said, though, about sort of the bigger picture. We've given you all the small picture, the details, the tactical stuff we have to do, but there's a big picture. I'm not going to go through all this right now, but I want to say that we're all trying to help our organizations be successful. And what we're going to come out of this, that the economy, everything is going to be different. And what used to make us a great employer won't necessarily be the same thing that makes us a great employer when we come out of that. So we need to be thinking about the big picture. What is the image of our organization? And how do we continue to create an image, and probably a new and somewhat different image, that gives the right perception? So our image is driven by people's perception of us. What is the perception of us going to be when we come out of this? And you need to think about that. We as HR people need to think about that for our employers, because the standards of performance are changing right now every day. And we need to think about the big picture things. How are we going to show that we're doing the right thing? Will our employees see us doing the right thing? Will our customers see us doing the right thing? And a great example I heard this weekend was of food places. You may know the best hamburger place in the city, and it's awesome. Now, I don't eat hamburgers very often, but this weekend I happened to eat them twice. I had one on Friday night, and guess what? It was at a drive-through. And oh my gosh, what an impression they made on me. Of course, you talk to them over the phone. That's pretty easy. But you pull up, the woman had a hat on. She had a face mask on. She had glasses on. And she had gloves on. And everything, you know, I could see the people behind her were dressed the same way. They gave this great impression of that they're going to take care of me. When they, instead of taking my card, they handed the machine out the window so I could slide my card in, pull it out. They didn't touch it at all. And they didn't touch my card. That was great. And when they gave me my food, it was all already bagged. They set it in a tray and handed the tray out. So they were clearly showing me we are taking extra care in this restaurant to provide safe food. Then on Sunday night, I went to a really well-known, very popular, longtime steakhouse to get a hamburger. I had to walk inside to get it. They didn't used to do that. They used to bring it out, but they didn't. And you know what? No one in there had on gloves. No one had on masks. They took my card and disappeared for 5 minutes with it. And afterwards I thought, well, would I rather have a great steak burger or would I rather go someplace where I know I'm safe? And suddenly the standard changes. So you need to think about that in your organization. How is the standard changing? How is safety changing? Are we taking this safety thing serious enough? Have you lost friends? Do you understand that 253 deaths impacts a lot of people in Kentucky, 60,000 in the United States? Are we able to feel what our employees are feeling? Are we able to feel what our customers are feeling? This is really important for us to be able to feel it so we can address their feelings in the way we send out the right perceptions so they know we're a great organization. So think about this. We need to think ahead of what's going on. The questions you're asking are awesome. Keep asking them. We're going to fire out notes after this meeting. If you have questions during the week, we'll try to address those. We'll send out all the answers to the ones we answered today. Thank you all for being with us. We really appreciate it. Glad Andy, the governor was here. I think he did a nice job. Have a great week. Think about your culture. How does your culture change? How do you send out a great message going forward? God bless each of you. Have a wonderful week. Let's make it great. That's
Thanks,
all.
Lyle.
You bet.